getting the recording on. So that should be on. And let me share my screen here. Cool. So what I want to do with today, I ended up adding a lot more examples in module 5. Is everyone able to see my screen? Cool, perfect. So I added a lot more examples to module 5, and I want to spend today going through these and 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 sort of use that as a way to go over what the sort of module 4.5 was. So as I mentioned, 4.5, it's meant to be more of a mini assignment. So I sort of I wanted to use a common data set for all of these. So I used the housing price data that I sort of had in the complex API example here. And hopefully, with seeing the example play out in a few different ways, it should give everyone more context in these sorts of tools. And then I'll start with just some intro JavaScript stuff, the examples that were there from the beginning, and then I added some Plotly examples and a Plotly and Flask example to bring together everything that we've been doing with 4.5 and then with module 5. So first to um, first, to sort of just quickly go through what assignment 5 is going to be. There's a few parts to assignment 5, and it's and for this assignment, you'll be doing 2 out of the 3 parts, and this is meant to get people a bit more acquainted with working in JavaScript and HTML. So anyone who's planning on this is meant to give people just enough of a background to use a lot of the popular visualization libraries out there. So I'm not expecting everyone to be web developers by the end of this, obviously, but what I'm hoping is you'd be able to pick up the various JavaScript libraries out there, Plotly.js, Vega Lite, D3 if you're making sort of working with more raw visualization types, Leaflet if you're doing mapping, etc. So the 3 parts, they're sort of increasing in complexity. So there's sort of a beginner part 1, an intermediate, and then a more advanced part involving Flask. So for and I'll go through these first, and then we'll go through a few of these examples, which hopefully will provide the context here. So for part 1, there's just a few sort of simpler functions to write here. So things like reversing a word that's typed in, or essentially printing a multiplication table. So basically using this sort of HTML, taking in a number from that, calculating multiples, and formatting those multiples into a table. Part 2 is bringing in is sort of working with some data, and basically, in this case, it's not this assignment isn't really visualization based. This is more meant to sort of get at the fundamentals of either working with JavaScript with part one, with part two working with D3, sort of non-visualization aspects of it. So the aspects that connect it to data sources, which is sort of the most powerful part of that library. And then, so here there's a data set, and we want to be able to display the data in a table, as well as be able to look up the data. So have the user type in some input and be able to get that output. And then for part three, this is sort of a continuation of module 4.5. So, and I'm keeping it as fairly open-ended. So it's basically using essentially using the API that you guys built in 4.5, and essentially designing a front end for that. So it's pretty open ended, and hopefully, looking at a few of these examples, we'll be able to get more insight into what could potentially be done for part three. So I'll leave the details there when we go through the examples. So before I get started going through these examples, are there any questions about the rest, about anything else, sort of sort of what the rest of the assignments and final project is going to look like, and sort of the rest of the course? There was one question. Yes, and Brian asked, are we presenting the final project to the class? You absolutely will. So the final project, it's due on the 21st, I believe is when I said it, that Friday, the end of that week. And that Tuesday will be our last meetup. So during that last meetup, we'll be doing our presentation. So I'm expecting most of your final project like the vast majority of your final project to be done by that Tuesday. And what I'm hoping, what I'm hoping we get from those presentations is a mostly complete, a pretty much completed final project. And then really, there will be feedback, and use those final days to just incorporate some of that feedback and work on sort of the final polish, the very final polish. But otherwise, everything should be set by that Tuesday. I believe it's the 17th, if I remember correctly. But yeah. So for that, I could actually go to our meetups here. The 19th. So that 19th is December 19th is going to be our last meetup, and that's going to be where we'll be scheduling that. Brian also asked how long should the presentations be. They should err towards the short side, 5-10 minutes. It's we do have a lot of them to get through, and what I'm probably going to do is make it more of a combo meetup with the two sections. So we do have sort of a cap with this GoToMeeting. So so what I'm thinking we'll do is we'll aim to sort of stagger it out. As people are presenting, some people could leave could leave halfway through, let the sort of other students join in, and because these presentation days always go over, and so it's we have to get through everyone. So the best way to do that, I think, would be to combine those two. The Kelly asked when the proposal feedback will be in. was hoping to have it in already, but it's tomorrow. I should have some time to take a look at that. But definitely by this week, I'm prioritizing the proposal feedback over the I'm prioritizing the proposal feedback over the rest of the grading, although I also will be getting those assignments back to you. Everyone should have assignments 1 and 2 graded, and 3, 4, and 4.5 will be graded shortly. And Chunhui asked about JSONify and toDict, these functions that we were using in Flask. And I'll be getting into this. We'll start with a few non-Flask examples, and and hopefully these examples will show why something like Flask could be useful if you guys are choosing to use JavaScript. But so Chunhui, that'll be answered towards the end of this meetup. That'll be the last example that we go through. So stay tuned for that. So does anyone else have any questions before we dive into a few of these examples? Cool. So let's jump in then. So a lot of these examples, they're brand new. So I posted them yesterday. So you might not have come across them yet, but but they're pushed to the GitHub, so the course GitHub. So you'll be able to access them there. And we'll start just by looking at the simple hello world example. So I'll bring in some, so I'll open up these 2 files, and we'll talk about sort of how to work with JavaScript. So this app here is just a pure JavaScript app. Most of the code is actually written within the HTML page, but usually the script, your JavaScript will be sort of in a separate file like this, and you import it into your HTML just to keep your, just to keep things a bit more cleaner here. So the way to run these, you could sort of see here, and I'll probably change this to the Python 3 example, which is http.server. But Python comes with its own web server, and that's pretty much the best way to run these. So whenever, if you have an app in a folder like this, you would simply navigate to that folder. So you can see what I have here. We'll go to Hello World, and let me get the correct environment. So you can see I'm using http.server. There's also simple HTTP server that's still there. I just find it easier to remember http.server. And wherever you run this, it will just open up a local server, and you'll be able to, what was it, 8,000. So you'll see the port that it's serving from. And if you have an index.html, it'll lead you directly to that file, or it'll basically lead you directly to the page that you want it to show. But here, because it's named something else, we have to go to the JS in a web page.html. And so basically, this is just sort of Hello World app that's meant to go through a few sort of simpler things that you could do with JavaScript. So there's a few examples where we're just simply writing to a document directly. So you could see we're just simply adding the sort of HTML elements. This P bold, B is bold, adding them like this. Each script is separated by these script tags, and it's just writing to the file. So um, before I get any further, just to try to survey people, and feel free to just add this to the chat so I get a general idea. Um, like how would you guys characterize what you've your experience with HTML or JavaScript if you have any? And it's okay if you don't really have any, or if it's sort of using something like GeoCities or one of those old school um, page builders, something like that. Interesting. So we have some basic HTML. Brian has jQuery. It's actually more than me. I haven't really used jQuery that much. Yeah, Brian mentioned that's so much nicer than raw JavaScript. I've been next on my list has been trying to get into React. That's sort of the that's what Dash uses, and that's really what I haven't gotten too much into React, like really just in terms of digging into some of the Dash components. So we have a lot of basic HTML, so that's good. So when you guys are seeing these tags, there's and I'm I imagine a lot of people like you seeing HTML in other contexts. It's pretty usually most people I imagine most people in this program have at least at some point come across HTML. And if anyone hasn't, feel free to like put it in the chat, and we'll go, more into detail there. Or feel free to email me privately if you would rather do that. So basically, what we ended up, what this is showing is, you could have essentially you put your JavaScript just within these script tags, and once you're in this script tag, you're able to access the document itself. So so you could see like you're adding these different elements to the scripts to the page. You have things that are sort of hard coded in. So these these are sort of hard coded, and then you have things that are coming in from JavaScript. So when we look at what's happening here, you could see this is where we're adding, while you were working on JavaScript, and you could see that being added right here. So what we'll do next is show off the console within a browser. So I recommend using Chrome. Chrome has the best, or at least in my opinion, like from what I've used, has great dev tools, which will help you in debugging as you're working on your projects. So basically, we have some, we have this code here, and we could try to use the console to see where the bug is with this code. So far, we're only writing to the document. So the way to access DevTools is just either right click or double click, depending on whether you're using Windows or Mac, and just go to inspect. And what you'll see are, and you'll see a few things come up here. So first thing to highlight here is what you get under elements is pretty much the page as it currently exists. So you'll notice that here we hard coded these. We're using JavaScript to add these elements, and you'll just see these elements written out. So here, like, we have a P and a B element being added, and you'll see that P and B element added right here. So one way of just simply making sure your app is working is to see what you have on the page. Like since we're just dealing with text, we could just read whether or not the text is there. But if you're dealing with sort of hidden divs or sort of more complex structure of your page, then you would be able to go into elements and sort of see what's being rendered there. And I won't be going through all of these tabs. Again, we're not sort of aiming for total expert here. We're aiming for just enough to use the visualization packages that are out there. But let's try to take a shot at debugging. So there is. So as I mentioned here, there's some bug, and let's try to find what's happening. So after elements, you have the console here. And the console, you could think of this as, similar to if you're opening up Python in the terminal. So if I just do something like this, I'm able to run Python commands. Here it's similar to that. So you're able to write JavaScript and get the results here. And you would also be able to see what sorts of errors are occurring. So I thought this actually was printing out something, but let's try to find out what the what bug we have. Actually, I just realized what I did. I had a bug here, and I didn't end up correcting it. So let's. So I'll just show you guys what ends up happening when there is a bug. So let's just add something like this. Let's refresh this. And we should be getting an error there. So never mind that. So let's just skip this particular area here. So basically, the console is there to essentially it'll show errors as you're getting them. It'll hopefully give you that traceback experience that you would get when you're debugging any other sort of code. Oh yeah, Chunhui, that's right. I forgot to. Thanks for reminding me of that. So what I forgot to do was cut the localhost. Let's restart it. So now we're reserving everything. And when I refresh this, let's see if I'm still getting an error. Forgot what the error, I mean, I'm just adding sort of a close P that doesn't match what's happening there. So I'm not sure why that's not bugging out the way, let's just try this. I forgot the actual error I had there. Okay, so I forgot the actual error that should have been there. You could see that this is obviously giving us some weird things with the text here, but I thought that would be also giving us a an error here. And Chunhui, are you talking about the error I'm seeing here, the 404? Okay, that's something. This is something. Actually, I'm not sure what exactly this is, but it's essentially global across all pages. There's I'm pretty sure it has to do with the icons at the in the corner here. Um, so when you have your different tabs and you have those icons, there's a way to sort of serve those. So I'm pretty sure that's what that's referring to. And Chunhui, is this? Are you getting these errors running this on your own?
Yeah, so many times.
Okay, was that with this JS, the Hello World example? Was it with the Hello World example, or okay, you could put in the chat what was coming up there, but let's just continue here. So let's refresh this. We'll get past that bug there. And so basically everything else that's just in the Hello World page, it's meant to show what you're what you're able to do. So for here, we're looking at sort of using JavaScript to just do simple math. Being able to get this 5 + 5 = 10, and rather than just hard coding that, we're actually running the code and writing the results. So here we're just sort of adding them. This will come in handy as you're using functions like d3.csv or d3.json, but mostly d3.csv, since I believe by default everything comes in as strings. But if you put a plus sign next to a variable, that means that the variable is forced to be either an int or a float. So using the console to see what that looks like, if I have so, and actually, let me do that. So we have a variable here. It's a string, but if we did that plus b, then we're seeing the integer 5 rather than the string 5. So So that's just one thing that'll come in handy as you're reading in the CSVs, because a lot of the numbers by default will come in as strings. So you could see how I'm, just to get my answer, using those plus signs, using built-in functions. So this is just sort of the math library, which has a lot of basic mathematical functions. This is just creating a random number. You have functions like, built-in functions like getting the date. And then, this is where you really get into some more, complex stuff that you're able to do. So basically, in the HTML, we have we have this here, and what I'll actually do is, sort of get down. So, as we're sort of, if you were just checking out this page and you wanted to, have an idea of, what was used to create this form, by going into elements, you're able to sort of see what was happening there. So in this case, it's the form tag, and then you have just a text input and a button. So basically, this is where the um, and so basically with this sort of input, you have your text, and we're pointing to, like when you have a button, buttons have an attribute called onClick. So here, like, and just to sort of get this terminology out of the way, so when you have things like, here you have a script and you're defining what the type is. This type is called an attribute, and that'll come in handy when we get more into working with D3. So, when you have a button like this, you sort of point it to a function. That function is defined right here. So what we're doing is, so in this case, we're just getting the target in question, and essentially, checking the number. So here, you could sort of see how we're doing this. We're checking if a number is even or odd, and if it is divisible by 3. So 6 is even, divisible by 3. 7 is odd, and not divisible by 3. So you could see how that's being checked over there. This is accessing this is just accessing this div right here. So you can see this get element by ID. We have the ID equals target, and we're setting the inner HTML of that div by using this divis function. And I'm running out of time a bit here, so I don't want to just go through everything here, but this basically, you are sort of just manually setting the inner HTML of that div and using the functions above to essentially, print out what is happening with the number. So I'll let you guys sort of go through the logic of how that's actually being set, how you end up with this string. But, just to sort of focus on how exactly that's populating in the document here. So, so you're able to sort of do it in that way. So we'll move on to a few of the more complex examples here. So the next example that I want to go into is the D3 example. And this is a really simple one. So, basically, and let me also get into this here. So this should be posted in I believe I posted it either in the course GitHub page or the content. I'll make sure it's posted, and if not, if not, I'll put out an announcement on where you could get this. This is a really good, sort of reference for D3, and I'll highlight a few, a few sort of chapters to hone in on. This is meant to be sort of a, more reference like book, so I don't want to treat this as, sort of doing particular readings. I'll just sort of focus on what I found is the best way, sort of the best way to sort of read this to, get a bit up to speed as to what D3 is doing. So the first 5 chapters, I would say, are the most are the most important ones, with chapter 5 really being where you sort of get into the like what D3 is actually doing. The first couple of chapters are things like introductions and fundamentals of what you're working with. So things like HTML, just sort of working with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. And then with SVG as well. So what D3 is using is essentially this these. So I'll jump to this section here, because SVG are scalable vector graphics. So this goes through a few examples of what these are. So things like, these are things like draw a circle, draw a rectangle, draw a line, and D3, D3 is very sort of, you're building graphs from first principles essentially. So when you're building a bar graph, you're not actually saying, build me a bar graph. You're essentially telling D3 to build a bunch of rectangles and map the heights of those rectangles, or the widths if it's a vertical bar graph, to the data that you're working with. And this just goes through a few examples of what you're able to draw with SVG and what these sorts of elements look like. And then getting back to the chapter 5. Chapter 5 is where you essentially get into the meat of what D3 does. So here it goes through sort of building an example, pretty much exactly the same as the one that I'm building here. So this book, it's if you just Google the name, it'll be available out there. Try to find this, and I would not sort of I would skim a lot, like use this as a reference as you're playing around with things. And really, what I would use is this chapter 5 to get to I would start reading chapter 5 and use that to really get an idea of how D3 is working. So this builds the example that I'm going to show in a slightly slower way. So D3, it operates with essentially chaining functions like this. And what I'll do is just sort of quickly go through what something like this is doing. So we have our and let me do this. So let's look at what we have here. So this looks very, obviously this is, a very simple example that is meant to just show what exactly is happening here. So all we're doing is displaying the data itself. And so all it's doing is displaying a couple of numbers, and let's see how we ended up getting that there. So in the index.html, all I have is I have pretty much nothing defined, like predefined within here. I just simply have a this pointing to an external script here. So let's see what this is doing. So first, we have this data set, and we're just sort of using a simple array. So we're just defining it in here, and you could see these numbers look roughly related to what we have in this data set. So how are we getting essentially this data set to become something like this? So what the way that D3 works is you use select statements to select the element that you want to append inner HTML to. So in this case, we're just adding it directly to the body, though you'll see in a lot of my other examples, I'm usually attaching to divs that I'm defining in the HTML. And I have this select all, which is, in this case, select all P. And these elements don't exist yet. So basically, what this select all is doing is prepping D3, it's essentially saying, I'm going to add, a bunch of P elements. Then you have, you add the data. So this is binding these P elements to a data set. So in this case, just this right here, dot enter, which just simply iterates through the data. We actually append the P, and then we're adding text within the P. So this this dot text is simply adding the inner the sort of inner text to the tag here. And one thing, and the book goes through this a bit more in detail, but this is something that if you're coming from other languages, this seems sort of this is something that's sort of pretty common with JavaScript, but is coming from Python and R, not super common. If you could sort of see, we're not just sort of I'm not just saying something like in this case sort of relating the text to the data set. I'm actually essentially defining what's called an anonymous function. So here, like I'm just to illustrate like what I'm doing, I'm returning D plus 5. But if I wanted to just return the data itself, I would just sort of have this function return D. And the book goes through this, and I want to get through the other examples, so I'm not going to focus too much on this, but you could sort of see how this goes through this in a bit more slower pace, step by step, sort of going through what's happening here. So I recommend like reading through at least the first part of what's like this, what this is showing. So showing how it's binding data, and this pretty much builds that example one by one. Sort of showing you how to access the data in an array in the console, for example. So that's what's happening with this D3 example here. And next, I'll go into a more sophisticated example. So this is a Plotly.js example. And one thing before I get into this, I sort of used like I sort of highlighted D3 here, and even within the Plotly.js example, you'll see I'm using in this case D3 comes built in with Plotly, so I'm using D3 functions here. But when it comes to building graphs, if you guys are choosing to use JavaScript for your final projects, I would recommend, like, whenever possible, don't be afraid to just use a library like Plotly or like Vega Lite, where these plot types are predefined. So, with D3, as I mentioned, and I'll, there's the main, where is it? Thought I had this page open. So here, you'll see a lot of excellent examples using D3, and so here, for example, we just have um, this is a pretty standard histogram, but there's a lot that goes into that goes into making it. So we're making, like here, actually what we're doing, we're appending rectangles. So each one of these is sort of, we have our data, we have the math that we're sort of using to bin our data and create the histogram, and we're just appending rectangles for each of those data points. And it's this is great when it comes to more custom graph types. So things like chord diagrams. These are less, a lot of chart types like this, that are a bit more specialty. You'll see that it's something like this. You could define a visualization however you like. So using something like D3, you essentially you could really, your imagination is your limit in terms of creating unique visualization types. So D3 is very powerful, but it's also very low level. So it's better to sort of focus on libraries that are already out there, which make things a bit easier to work with. So let's get this example started. And so basically, what this example is doing, this is similar to examples that we've worked with in the past, using the same exact data, except this is made purely using JavaScript. So we have we just have our drop down here, and we're able to interact with the Plotly visualization here. And as ever, we have our housing price index data, and we have this is exactly the same as what we had in our Shiny example. So let's talk about what we're doing here to show something like this. So in our, let me clean this up a bit. So in the raw HTML, what I have is just a div that's labeled graph. So this is where I'm going to be putting my graph. And you could actually see here how that's happening. So all of this is Plotly stuff, but the sort of overarching div that I'm using, you could see that the Plotly graph is there. And I have just something else here that is defining the selector. And one thing to note is I left this undefined. So I hadn't added any values to the dropdown. And I wanted to sort of highlight that because essentially I'm using the data itself to populate the dropdown. So I'm looking at the I'm looking at the data, seeing what the unique metros are, and adding those to the dropdown. So that's so you can see how a lot of this is happening here. So I'm building my list of unique metros. One thing that for those getting used to JavaScript, it has sort of more. I almost think of them as sort of old school style for loops where you have something like this. So with for loops in JavaScript, you're actually iterating through the index. So if I were using this to iterate over an array, I would do something like get the length of the array and essentially iterate through over the indices, and then do something with the ith item of the array. But to get something that's more similar to what you would have in R or Python, there's this for each loop. So what I'm doing here is iterating over this variable called rows. And then so the next question is, what are these rows? So the first thing that I'm doing here is I'm reading data directly from CSV. So let's see what that, let's just quickly see what that looks like. So if I do this, and I'll get back here. So you can see with this console log, I'm using this to just inspect what's happening further. So I'm using this d3.csv function, and I want to see what it's actually giving me. What is the structure of it? And if I shut this off, restart, let's see what we get. So we have this complex, this sort of weird looking object here. It's, this number here, this means that it's an array of length 23,000. And let's see what each of these, 23,000 is a little, I don't know why there's so many showing up there, but basically let's look at, what this is showing. So, it's giving us an array, and for each element in the array, it's an object that looks something like this. So you could see what this d3.csv function is doing is it's reading in, it knows that these are the column headers. It's giving me the data, underneath. So for each row, it's essentially saying, my date is this, HPI, etc. So that's an example of, as you're working through this, like, what sorts of steps you would take to begin troubleshooting, begin finding out like what you're working with. Console log is your friend. It's a great way to check bugs. But let's see what's happening here. So we're building a unique a list of unique metros. So I'm just starting with an empty array and looping through all of the metro items. So essentially, whenever we have something keyed metro here, and checking if it's already in our list, using this metros.push, which is essentially just adding something to the array if it's not there. So that's how I'm adding these unique metros, and also this is starting to let everyone see essentially how low-level JavaScript is compared to using things like Python and R. So there is like it's unfortunate, but that's really JavaScript isn't at its core a data science language. It's it's more geared toward it's the language of the web. So there's so when you're trying to do operations in JavaScript, you unfortunately will sort of run into a lot of these more, lower level sorts of, sorts of things that, you'll have to do manually, whereas in Python or R, you would have a built-in function that gives you unique values. So we're doing that, and then we're adding those unique metros to the selector. So we're using a similar syntax that we were using before. We're tying it to we're using the data as metros. We're we're appending the text, and we're also using this dot attr. So if you remember what I mentioned about when you're looking at HTML, the something like this. So in this case, type is called an attribute, and what I'm doing here is essentially adding an attribute of whatever name I want to give it. So if I go back into here and go to my, so if you remember, we started out with just something like this, and now what we have is this is populated with options. So this value is what essentially the value that gets returned. So that's just one way of saying, like, you could have the essentially what's showing up in the dropdown be different than what you're sort of what value you're returning. So perhaps there's a metro code, for example, that you wanted to have as your value, but you wanted users to just interact with the metro name. So that's one thing to note about what's happening with the select there. And I have a function that's just creating a graph given a metro. So I define my function taking in a metro, and I'm creating a Plotly object. And Plotly plot.ly/javascript is the best place to go for info on using Plotly.js, and in particular, there's a lot of examples of different plot types, but there's also this function reference right here, and I'll be getting into this in a bit, but just keep note of this function reference as something that you guys should check out at your own leisure. So we, this function, all it's doing is creating a Plotly JSON object. So, you could see how these JSONs are being, created like so. That's all this function is doing. And then I'm essentially, using, so yeah, I'm going through each of the, I'll let you guys sort of check this out because I do want to try to get at the Flask example. So, so we have, this create graph function. Again, it's pretty low level. You'll find yourself wishing that there's an easier way to do these sorts of things. Hopefully that's what Flask will let us do. Return the object. And then I'm getting the graph div. So again, I'm using this document.getElementById to, I have my div here. If I want that div to just be, a variable, you use this getElementById. And I'm using one of the Plotly functions here. So in this case, I'm using plotly.newplot. And what this is doing, all it's doing is taking a div and adding the plot JSON to it. So using this data and layout. Alternatively, I could just include the figure, which is just a JSON object with the data and the layout defined. So so here I'm plotting the initial graph because the first value there is Atlanta. And then the last thing that D3 is doing to really show to really make this interactivity happen is this event sort of monitor, this way of tying the sort of events of doing this, like tying these to new graphs. And so what am I doing here? I'm using this select. I'm selecting the Metro selector. So if you remember, that's just this right here. I'm adding this dot on. So in this case, I'm saying change. And the key thing of, and also it's an anonymous function. So I'm passing in a function, I'm essentially calling this function whenever there's a change. And the key thing that's happening here is this d3.event.target.value. This is essentially the value that's getting returned here. So when I select Seattle, Seattle's the target that's getting returned. And once I do that, I'm using this command here, plotly.react. And plotly.react is just an easy way of like essentially changing a plot. So I'm providing a new figure, and it's just simply plotting that new figure. So that's what's happening with the event handler there. And then our last example, the Plotly.js and Flask. So if you, as you look through this create graph function, you'll see it's pretty, roundabout. I'm iterating through these rows. I am checking, what, for each row, I'm checking what the tier is. Depending on what the tier is, I'm adding it to its corresponding arrays and building my my Plotly object that way. But this is very low level stuff, and you may if you're building a complex app, you may not want to rely on JavaScript to do your do this sort of parsing for you. So that's where Flask comes in. And what I'm doing here, so there we are. So I'm going to run this Flask app that I have, and refresh this. I'm at a different port. So this is very similar to what we had before. I just added a separate dropdown for seasonality. So right now we have both metro areas and the seasonality here. And so what am I doing here? So first, let's clean everything up here. So now, Chunhui, I'll get back to the question that you were asking about, what was it you were asking? Yeah, you were asking about JSONify and toDict. So what JSONify, so basically Flask is, is essentially, you're creating the server side of an app. So so what I'm doing with whenever I'm setting something as JSONify, I'm essentially saying I want to return a JSON. So I build my dictionary, with Python. Dictionaries pretty much correspond to what JSONs are in JavaScript. Just these sorts of nested nested like keys and lists, sort of uh, nesting dicts within dicts, and that's almost exactly the same as a JSON object. So all JSONify is doing is taking what is technically a Python dictionary and serving that up as a JSON. And we are running out of time here, so I'll just mostly let you guys read through this example. But to show just a few key things that I'm doing, this I'm actually offloading almost everything to Python. So let's look at a few of the APIs that I have here. I have this, which was almost exactly the same as what I had in 4.5. I'm returning I'm returning some data based on the seasonality and metro. But you could see what I'm doing here. I'm actually building my Plotly figure. So I'm essentially leveraging Python to go through the data, do whatever needs to be done with the data, and return a Plotly object. So that once I am in JavaScript, all I'm doing is plotting that object. So this, if I go to /API /NSA / let's say Atlanta. That should be working. That's what I did. Cool. So all I'm doing with endpoints like this is returning some JSON data. So you could see like this is the Plotly graph already pre-built. And so I have that happening over here. And I also created a few helper. I also created a helper API. So I wanted something, rather than having to loop through the data and get unique values, I wanted to do that, do that within Python and just have something I could go to. So if I now go to HPI /values, I get my unique list of metros, my unique list of seasonality. So I used pandas to get those unique values, and I'm serving that via Flask. And then Chinhui, to answer your question, things like where was I using to? I'm not sure where I was using. I'm not remembering where exactly I was using toDict, but that's basically a way of converting a pandas data frame to a dictionary. And I think I had that in the 4.5 example here. I'm not remembering where exactly I had that, but basically, pandas data frames could be translated to dictionaries. And we're running out of time for our first section. The one thing that I do just want to mention is the so unfortunately we are running out of time here, so I have people coming in. So any other questions from section 1 and section 2 as people are filtering in? Welcome. The one thing I'll ask you guys to try to check out is if you notice with this Flask example, I had two drop downs, and I want you guys to sort of look through what I was doing to sort of access those to access sort of both dropdowns. So basically, when I choose something like Minneapolis, I'm still getting the not seasonally adjusted value for Minneapolis. And you'll see it's basically this right here. I'm just accessing the values the from from my select tags. So that's one thing I would sort of point out. But otherwise, I'm just simply using my Flask API to serve Plotly objects and using JavaScript to sort of to access them based on user interaction. So with that, you should be over for section 1. So thank you everyone for attending. And for those of you in section 2, I'll probably get started once again at 7:50.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night. And so I'm going to pause for everyone here. I'm going to pause my sharing, and we'll get started in a minute or two.